a lot of places have got very poor, even in rich countries. So the Treasury is designed not to look ahead. Its central task is just to survive this budget. Now, there's a lot of economists who change their views. Why? Because the problems have become more manifest. Building that shared identity happened in Tanzania. It was achieved, and it's a hugely valuable legacy. You and your audience, you're building the future. Don't make the mess of it that our generation made.
We'll try not to.
Today's episode is with world-renowned economist Sir Paul Collier. He's an economics professor at Oxford University and is renowned for his work in fields such as conflicts and left-behind places, especially in Africa.
He's also worked for the World Bank, where he was the chief of the Development Research Group. He was also part of Tony Blair's Commission for Africa, and because of his work, he was knighted by the Queen for his contribution to the field of economics.
Yeah. Today we talk about his new book, Left Behind, A New Economics for Neglected Places, which is a book that provides hope for these left behind places, and I would say also hope for economic policy in the future.
Yep.
We hope you enjoy. This was a great episode. We thank Sir Paul Collier for coming on, and we hope you enjoy. Like and subscribe if you like what we're doing, and enjoy.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Journalism is at least a profession, right? And it has some sort of standards.
Yeah.
Not very high, but it's got some standards. And at its best, a good journalist really, and I deal with a lot of journalists still.
Yeah.
And a good journalist really is able to craft a piece knowing their audience. And so they listen to what you say, but then they write something which summarizes for their audience how you're trying to reach them. And they're honest about it. So that's at its best, journalism's really good. And at its worst, social media is really terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a jungle out there.
Yeah.
It's awful.
And it's very fragmented. I mean, the people who built the technology thought it would unite the world, but instead it's fragmented people into echo chamber. People like to listen only to the things they like. And so there's very little listening to views that you disagree with.
I think that's it's extremely worrying because this problem is only getting worse with time.
Yeah.
And it's such a shame because we have these polarized silos of political thought, and the two sides refuse to engage with each other.
That's
so
right.
How can you have discourse about some of the most important topics? And it also kind of creates this tribalism as well.
Exactly.
It's so divisive.
Yeah.
I don't think politics was ever this tribal. I mean, I personally, I don't know.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
It's extremely hostile. Like even seeing the run-up to the US election, it's so hostile.
I mean, America 50 years ago, both parties were really very similar. Basically centrist parties, and it shifted really sometime after the 1960s. Shifted probably with the death, with the shooting of Kennedy, followed by Johnson getting into this disastrous war in Vietnam, and then with deciding not to stand again. Hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?
Yeah.
And then you, so that was the real disaster. And then you got Nixon, and Nixon then lying and being caught lying, falsifying stuff, and then he was impeached. Now, he was successfully impeached. That's why he quit. That's why he had to resign. But because it was a Democrat-led impeachment, the Republicans then reinterpreted it and said, "Oh, that was the Democrats dissing Nixon, and so we're going to do the same." And so that became the impeachment of, or the desperate attempts to impeach Clinton, which were ridiculous, utterly contrived. Okay, so he'd had an affair with a young woman. I mean, was that the first politician in the world who'd ever had an affair with a young woman? Believe me, not, right?
Yeah.
So impeaching him for that was preposterous. But that was, and once he'd been impeached by the Republicans, then the Democrats decided, well, now it's going to be our turn to get back. And that's how the perfectly legitimate attempt to impeach Trump won was interpreted or reinterpreted by the Republican Party as this is the Democrats' revenge for our impeachment of Clinton. You know, so it's become this sort of existential battle in which everything then gets decided in the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court is no longer really a court. If you look at it, everybody on that court, there are 9 of them, and they vote according to which party they belong to, which political party. And at the moment, it's 7-2 Republicans. But it's massively unhealthy when your top court, your Supreme Court, becomes that much politicized. And that's where we've got to in America. So it's very dangerous, especially now that I think Trump will quite probably win. And Trump 2 could be much more dangerous even than Trump 1. Because Trump 2 will be after vengeance.
Yeah.
What do you think are the real dangers with Trump's second term? Why do you think Trump's second term will be a lot more divisive than his first?
So I've got a new category of politician. We've long wanted conviction politics.
Yeah.
Politicians who were full of conviction. Trump is one of the politicians who give a new meaning to conviction politicians, because what Trump is trying to do is avoid conviction. And his best way of avoiding conviction is to get re-elected as president, because then he can't be jailed whilst he's president, and he can pass some law that exonerates him for all his past misdeeds. And he's not the only politician that's playing that. In Israel, I would say Netanyahu is the same thing. Netanyahu is basically desperate to stay as Prime Minister of Israel, because otherwise he would be prosecuted and convicted of corruption. And so we've got a new class of conviction politicians. Wow. That are politicians in order to avoid conviction.
Oh, wow. So you've flipped it.
Yeah. So that's a really sad state of affairs for democratic politics. Both Israel and America are democracies, but they're very badly functioning democracies now.
And you mentioned that the Supreme Court is highly politicized, but also many institutions now are so politicized. It's a shame to see that.
Yes, I think it is. I think we were discussing social media earlier and the polarization of people into echo chambers, where people within the community think the same way and listen to just the same things, and so don't get enough opportunity to hear opposing points of view. I in my classes, I get my students to read the same story in two politically opposed newspapers. It's easier to do in newspapers, and what they will, I teach them a couple of concepts. One is the concept of filtering out inconvenient facts, and so a lot of newspapers on both the right and the left do the same thing. They filter out stories that are inconvenient to their side. So that's a filtering out thing. And once you get your students to read these things as an exercise, spot the filtering out, and the other stuff, when news is big enough that you can't filter it out, it's world news, then what sometimes happens is what I call neutralizing propositions. So a politician has done something really, really stupid, and it's had a disastrous effect. It's had such a big effect that you can't suppress it. You can't filter it out. But what can the politician do? They can introduce a new proposition, which is a neutralizing proposition, which says, yes, but who's behind this criticism? Who's originating this criticism? They are, and then I give some examples. One of my favorite examples was President Erdogan of Turkey, who, coming up to an election, did a classic thing, printed a lot of money, which causes inflation, and that means the Turkish lira started to collapse. Right? Well, markets started to sell the lira because they could see that all this money printing was going to cause inflation, and that was going to be, bad for the economy. But then Erdogan introduced a new neutralizing proposition. Who's behind this speculation of the lira? It's where is it coming from, this speculation? It's New York. And who are the financial guys in New York? In other words, he was whispering, it's Jews. and that was a neutralizing proposition. And the sad thing is, enough people in Turkey bought that explanation and said, it's the Jews at it again. That's it. Right? So that's an example of a neutralizing proposition, right? And once you've got these concepts of filtering out and neutralizing propositions, you can see them at work, warping, distorting politics away from actually facing reality every day of the year. That's just in newspapers. Before we start on anything like podcasts other than your own.
I think that's why we kind of started this is just to have these unfiltered conversations and interact with both sides. Because I think I used to be very ideological, and I used to refuse to engage with anything that didn't fit my point of view. But I actually find you learn so much more when you're willing to go out and seek a counter argument for all your beliefs, and it just bolsters your knowledge, I think. And it's such a shame that we're seeing this dynamic persist in the media,
especially with social media now.
It's terrible. So that was so interesting what you said about the Democrats and the Republicans, because I always thought, it's social media's fault for the tribalism. But just to go back and pinpoint the time of when it happened, and you can see the polarization between the parties through these historical events is fascinating.
Before that, they were really very, very similar, as was British politics. I mean, British politics has never become anything like as tribal as American. But if you go back to the 1950s, British politics was really, again, very, very, very centrist, really. In fact, there was a term in Britain known as Butscalism, which was a guy called Butler, who was the head of thought in the Conservative Party, and Gaitskell, who was leader of the Labour Party. And basically, their views were pretty well interchangeable, hence the term Butscalism. So that was then. You wouldn't say that now in British politics.
Gosh, I think it's terrible. I mean, we're not as bad as the US.
No, we're not.
not far off. Not far off whatsoever.
Do you think, so there are these different silos and people don't want to listen to the other side. Do you think that also applies to economists, that they are all maybe in their own school, or they believe what they believe, they don't want to listen to the other side? Because I feel like there's I think that applies to like many different, aspects of life. People never want to, exchange with something that might be different than what they know.
Yeah, I think economics has been pretty guilty of that. But quite a few economists nowadays are rethinking the economics that I taught 20 years ago. I'm now ashamed of having taught it. So my own views have moved quite a lot over the last 20 years. And more recently, that's quite a few economists and mainstream economists have rethought. I mean, my new book, Left Behind, has now got strong public statements of support from about 15 very fancy economists, much fancier than I am, including, I suppose, the fanciest in the world. There's only one living economist who has a Nobel Prize in economics all to himself, and that's Angus Deaton, who was the editor of the main Econometrica journal, top journal in the world for economics, and he just last year wrote a book which was basically mea culpa, an apology, saying that, the idea, and it's called Economics in America, and it's really an admission that actually a lot of the views I had have turned out not to be right, and hence the strong support for my own views. And that is very heartening. So, I mean, I was just in Italy last week doing a tour of the Italian translation of Left Behind, and I was talking to yesterday. I was talking with the guy who was a top economist in the Bank of Italy, which is sort of. You'd expect to find a complete center of orthodoxy. But as he said, really, a lot of the views in Left Behind are now pretty mainstream. They wouldn't have been 10 years ago. But now there's a lot of economists who've changed their views. Why? Because the problems have become more manifest. There are so many communities, places that have got left behind. And we can't walk away from these big, ugly facts, especially since there are some societies where that hasn't happened.
What are some of those big, ugly facts, do you think?
I think the big, ugly facts are that a lot of... So there's a fact which is a lot of places have got very poor, even in rich countries. Poor places even in fast, successful, growing countries. In America, I work closely with Colombia, which is a successful Latin American country, but it's two coastal regions. It's an unusual. Colombia is an unusual place because it's got both a Pacific coast and an Atlantic coast. But both the coastal provinces are much poorer than the capital city and the region around the capital city, Bogota. And why is that? Because the Colombia, like Britain, is very, very centralized, far too centralized. And in Britain, if we think back to Brexit for a moment, every region of England, other than London, voted for Brexit. Why did they vote for Brexit? It wasn't really anything to... Brexit was about withdrawing from the European community. It wasn't really anything to do with the European community. The European community only handles 1% of our national income. London, Whitehall, handles 40% of our national income. So this was a case of a mutiny against Whitehall. All the major political parties said Brexit would be a disaster. And this was a chance to mutiny against this sort of London-centric view of the world. It was very sad because Brexit turned out to be a disaster for the poor regions because they were the ones that were still making stuff and selling it to Europe. And with Brexit, it became much harder to sell goods to Europe. London, although it was very committed to staying in the European community, it wasn't really very important for London economically, because London's big trades are global trades with East Asia and with North America. It's the middle time zone. So those are big, ugly facts about places that are left behind. And then there's a big, ugly fact about what happens to them when they're left behind. And that is that market forces amplify the falling down. They don't rectify it. And that is, as soon as you think about it, it's fairly obvious. But I think I was at least one of, if not the first economist to just lay that out very clearly, that market forces amplify divergence for the very simple reason that that investors move into places that are starting to be successful and out of places that are starting to fall down. So anywhere that's hit by a shock and starts to decline, the investors move out of there, not into it. Now that's true within Britain, investment moved into London and not into and out of the provincial cities. It's more dramatically true when we turn to the continent that I've particularly worked with and on, which is Africa. And Africa has seen big capital outflows, big investment flows out of Africa for a long time, certainly for the last 10 years, including, incidentally, China. China's been moving money out of Africa for the last 10 years. And so that massive flow of investable capital out of Africa into India, China, America is a sort of absurd byproduct of market-driven capitalism.
Wow.
I think it's when you mention that these market forces make things worse, and you start the book Left Behind by really highlighting that, I think anyone would be really surprised when reading this book, because you're known as a mainstream economist throughout your career, but you start this book and with a critique of Friedman and this critique of market forces, which is basically what mainstream economics was, right? Let the market do its thing. And yeah, I think many would be surprised. They wouldn't expect that from you.
Well, I learned over the last 20 years, and learning from experience is a tough school. But if people, you should be celebrating that people do learn from experience, rather than clinging on desperately to defend an indefensible ideology.
Paul, could I ask you, what was the journey like in switching from being a mainstream economist to a heterodox? Like, what did you realize? What was the light bulb moment for you, or was there one?
Yes. Now that's.
And would you consider yourself a heterodox economist?
I'm sorry.
Would you consider yourself a heterodox economist?
I think the mainstream is now pretty close to me, because I think enough. Now that I've got, as I say, about 15 very fancy endorsements, public statements of support.
So the mainstream has changed. It's not that definition is not correct anymore.
I think so. Yeah.
So you think the mainstream has essentially become a lot more heterodox?
At last, yes.
That's interesting.
And that I think is very healthy. It's a weird profession that never changes its mind, regardless of the evidence. That's not science. That's an ideological belief. It's dogmatism, and now we do get our sort of dogmatism sometimes in science. I mean, there's a famous saying that science advances one death at a time, because people who discovered something that was good for a while then defend it even when the evidence has moved on. So that idea that it takes deaths to silence some people may well turn out to be true. Fortunately, in my case, and in Deaton's case, a lot of different economists, we've seen the evidence, and so we've changed our views. That's very healthy and should be celebrated. You should be worrying about the dogmatism of some people that never change. And as I criticize in the book, Britain has one of the centres of dogmatism in the British Treasury, and it's so dogmatic because it's run like a monastery. People go in as their first job, having got a good economics degree from Oxford or London or even Cambridge, let's say. That was a joke.
I felt that.
And so after your good degree and your good masters and all the rest of it, you fast track into the Treasury. And the Treasury, really, that's the entry point to the Treasury. It's run like a monastery. You go in when you're young, and you may leave, but the only entry point is as one of those young monks. And then what are you when you come in as the most junior monk? The senior monks say, this is how we sing the chants or whatever, and so you're trained within the Treasury philosophy, and the Treasury philosophy is a sort of nearly a paranoid belief that every one of its big enemies are not people like us. Its big enemies are the other ministries in Whitehall. The Ministry of Transport. Terrible. They're going to spend money on transport, because if they don't spend money on transport, they have nothing to do. And the minister who's responsible for transport, of course, what will he be doing in cabinet? He wants to announce a new transport policy, more roads, more trains, whatever. He wants to spend. And in that cabinet, there are usually 30 ministries in the spending ministries. It's 30 voices in cabinet. And the only voice in cabinet saying we can't afford it is the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance. And so we, the brave warriors, the civil servants in the Treasury, we're there to defend the taxpayers against all these pressures of spending in the ministries. How are we going to do that? By controlling all the spending. Control it. Don't let the spending ministries spend money, except every spending decision we have to approve. And that mentality includes the statement, if they've not spent money by the end of the year, the fiscal year, end of March, any unspent money we reclaim.
Okay. And that's why you say the Treasury suffers from short-termism.
Absolutely. It's a disaster because the Treasury is tasked, its central task is setting the budget each year, just as we're going to hear
in
any minute.
October.
And that attitude of we've got to save money is a disastrous set of short-termism. It means that we nowhere looks ahead. So the Treasury is designed not to look ahead. Its central task is just to survive this budget. And the other ministries are not given budgets beyond 1 year.
Oh, wow. So there's absolutely no scope for long-term planning.
Yeah.
Within the Treasury.
And beyond, what lies beyond beyond Whitehall? Oh, the worse evil, worse even than the spending ministries, is local governments, the regional governments. Oh my God. What do they want to do? Just spend money.
Why do you think the UK has an issue with, well, I mean, we're in the process of more devolution, but historically we've been very centralized and the idea of devolution has somewhat been frowned upon. But you kind of mentioned that the Treasury needs to be, we need to have this devolution process and it needs to become more long-term. So do you think if we continue with devolution, we would definitely see some of the issues that have plagued the northern towns start to be rectified?
Yeah, because the devolution has some big advantages. One is it people have more knowledge of local context. I mean, the absurdity is that the Treasury has been responsible for designing bus routes in Manchester.
Yeah.
Treasury officials who've
So far removed.
maybe
from
never been to
Yeah.
Manchester. I mean, we can't run. Who knows about bus routes, and what should the accountability for bus routes be in Manchester? Should it be the Treasury scrutinising how well the Ministry of Transport decides what bus route should be run in Whitehall? No. Accountability should be local voters in the Manchester region. And so the accountability model that would work would be local governments, government of Manchester responsible for the bus routes, citizens knowing that, and then voting in local elections to say, I don't think the bus routes are any good. Or, if the bus routes have got a lot better, we'll re-elect the mayor. Right? So accountability shouldn't be through the Treasury, it should be through voters. We are, believe it or not, a democracy. We're not a very good one, but democracies depend upon accountability to voters, not accountability to the Treasury.
So how can you talk to us your journey to reaching this light bulb moment, so we can see how can the Treasury learn from this to start changing their mind?
Oh, so for me it was a highly personalized journey because I grew up in Sheffield. Both my parents left school when they were 12, so I was an unlikely kid to move from that background to becoming a professor at Oxford. But that's what happened. And it would be much harder now for somebody with my background. But the Sheffield in my day was quite a proud city. It was the city where forging specialist steel, the Bessemer process, had been invented. So it was a proud city with a very skilled and very large working class. It was a working class city, but the people of Sheffield, the workers in the steel industry, were very skilled.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of pride. And one of my favorite stories of Sheffield is the founding of Sheffield University. Sheffield University was founded by the city coming together around the need for a university. That was partly a little bit of local rivalry because Manchester had just got a university. So it was partly Sheffield saying, well, if Manchester's got a university, we're going to have one, just as good. But that was a sort of trivial little bit, a little incentive, a little bit of competition, never hurts. But basically, it was the workers of Sheffield realizing that a lot of them were like my parents. They'd had no education. But they saw that the future of Sheffield depended upon having education. And for that, you needed a university. And so the top steel baron in Sheffield, a guy called Firth and Company, the biggest steel company, got together with the trades union. And the trades union had a voluntary levy of all steel workers. It was voluntary, but as far as I can see, every steel worker in Sheffield paid. And how much did they pay? They contributed an entire week's wages So every steelworker gave an entire week's wages, and then all that money was matched by Firth, and that became the endowment for Sheffield University,
Wow.
which is now one of the top 100 research universities in the world.
Oh, wow.
So that was a very far-sighted gesture by people like my mum and dad, who themselves had no education, but saw that it was important that the next generation should have better. So I was the generation that benefited from all that. But it's a splendid story of a form of capitalism which is not exploitative. Why were the steelworkers able to contribute a week's wages? Because Firth paid them a decent wage. It's what the philosopher Michael Sandel calls contributive justice. Quite a lot of your listeners will probably have heard of Michael Sandel. He's a professor at Harvard, a political philosopher, and he's put his Harvard course onto edX, and 30 million people have watched that course from around the world. It's a brilliant course. So if any of your listeners haven't watched it, it's well worth watching. It's well worth listening to, right?
Yeah.
It's quite funny as well. He's a very good guy. And Sandel is the moral philosophy that is left behind. And I'm very pleased that he's publicly supported Left Behind as a book. But his big concept is contributive justice. The idea that, first of all, everybody should have equality of voice and equality of respect. Everybody should be in a position to contribute to the whole. And as long as we've got those conditions, which maybe 120 years ago in Sheffield applied well enough that people were willing to contribute to the whole. The workers were well enough paid, had enough voice that everybody could agree that, yes, what we want is a university. And that was contributive justice. So it's a splendid illustration of contributive justice. Have we got those conditions in place today? No, certainly not in America. I think not really in Britain either. What Michael Sandel says, well, if you haven't got equality of voice, equality of respect, and enough material equality that people can all contribute to the whole, these become first-order requirements for public policy. You've got to get those conditions in place, because otherwise you can't expect a democracy to function well. It won't come together around common objectives. Mm. And that's in the extremes that we've got now. We've got polarized societies. I sometimes describe them as lobotomized societies, one half not listening to the other, as if the two halves of the brain have been severed.
Yeah.
And that can't work.
Mm. I mean, it's a shame because, it seems to only get worse with time.
Well, to be fair, Leveling Up, Left Behind is a very hopeful book.
It's so hopeful.
Yeah.
It's so optimistic.
Yeah.
But you kind of you look around you and you hear the discussions in...
Well, we're starting from a bad place. Fortunately, there's a lot of the future left, right? And it'll be up to guys of your age, not guys of my age, right? Guys of my age have left the mess. Guys of your age must clean it up. We've cleaned up very much worse in the past. Right? Yeah. If you look at the period immediately after 1945, the crisis that certainly that Europe, but really the world faced after 1945, was an order of magnitude worse than the crisis we face now. But a generation of good leaders, modest leaders, in America, Truman, who nobody thought anything of. They thought he'd just be they thought he'd lose the election and was be a failed figure. He won an election and rose to the occasion. He was a modest guy. Modest is quite a good virtue in a politician, especially a politician who doesn't really know what to do. If you don't know what to do, learn fast. In Britain, we got at the same time another very modest guy, Attlee. Attlee won the 1945 election. And again, there's this sense of modesty, and we need to. I find myself in charge at a moment in history when we've got to do a good job. And so Attlee and Truman really helped to build a post-war world. And while their achievement was just astonishing, they set up a global public bank, which was called the International Monetary Fund. They set up a fund for reconstruction, which became the World Bank. They set up a system for avoiding the protectionism, the growth of protectionism that had happened in the 1930s. And that was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So these were three giant achievements. And they lasted, the good effects of them lasted for about 30 years. The results across Western Europe were astonishingly successful. The French know them as the 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years from 1945 to 1975, a spectacular recovery. France in 1945 was extremely fragile, extremely fragile. There was a huge communist party, which looked as if it could take over at any moment. The Russians looked as if they were in a position to, any moment, France could have collapsed. And yet, the first loan of the World Bank was to, and the IMF was to France, and it was on a one-page sheet of paper, an agreement between the French Minister of Finance and the President of the World Bank and the head of the IMF, which just said, we will use this money to invest in infrastructure to rebuild France. That was a loan equivalent to many billions today. And as I was brought in by the French for the 75th anniversary of the founding of all these things. And I pointed out to the French finance minister that at the time, France was just as fragile as many African countries are now. And he looked a bit offended at first, but then thought about it and decided it was actually right. Wow. Why does it matter? Because nowadays, the IMF and especially the World Bank are much, much more conservative. They're not lending big money to fragile places. And so that is a betrayal of what these institutions were founded to do.
Why do you think that is? Just because previous instances have failed miserably. So they kind of they don't want to persist with a failed investment anymore.
I think we're back to a Treasury mentality, British Treasury, of short-termism. Don't put taxpayers' money at risk. Well, actually, if you want to avoid disaster, you've got to take some risks, because there is no textbook that says, here's how a poor country will develop. We've got some reasonable ideas, but we don't. But every country is a bit different. Context matters. Every country is going to have to do it for itself. Agency matters. If the people of the country don't want to do it and the government of the country doesn't want to do it, it won't happen. And so there are powerful reasons for saying you have to take a risk and let a country work out a path for itself. The idea you've got to, and in miniature, we've seen that with the Treasury not wanting to give money to local authorities, not wanting to give money to Manchester. But if you don't give money to Manchester, Manchester will never build the capacity to plan forward. If you give power to all the regions of England, there are 14 regions now, they will do different things. Some will do things that are more successful than others, but they're a network group. The mayors will watch each other, learn from each other. That's fine. It doesn't even matter if the Treasury learns what's sensible. The Treasury shouldn't be in the decision-making process, probably, or much more minor role. In Left Behind, I give the example of one of my unlikely economic heroes, Deng Xiaoping, who became the head of the Chinese government in 1980. And Deng Xiaoping was a bit like Truman and Attlee in the sense that he was a provincial kid, he was a modest guy. He kept his provincial accent all his life when he came to Beijing. And the first thing he did was recognize that he didn't know what to do. He knew China was very, very poor, which it was in 1980. It's hard to think back to 1980. You two weren't even born then. But 1980, China was dirt poor. It was the epicenter of global poverty.
Wow.
Where was the bulk of poor people in the world? China, right? You wouldn't say that now.
No.
But how did China get from where it was in 1980 to where it is now? And the answer is Deng Xiaoping built an economic model which emphasized rapid learning. First, he had enough modesty to go and look elsewhere. And so he went and visited Singapore and Japan. Well, under Mao Zedong, who just died, which was Mao Zedong's great contribution to human progress, was to drop dead. Like not just science advances one death at a time, sometimes so does politics. What did Deng Xiaoping learn from visiting Japan and Singapore? That these were pretty successful places where poor people weren't starving in the streets. In fact, there weren't very many poor people. People were being lifted out of poverty. So one of the things he did was say, well, I wonder if we can get things like Singapore in China. Could we choose one or two cities on the coast of China and turn them into experiments in being Singapore? And he did that. He appointed mayors and said, in this city, you can do what you want. Just you yourself go and visit Singapore, see if you can learn from that. And that became Shanghai, Schengen, enormously successful places, So that was one thing he learned. But his main innovation was to build on the old Mandarin tradition of taking an exam to get into the Chinese civil service.
Oh, wow.
And the Mandarin tradition, which I'm sure you learn if you're in the Chinese department at SOAS, the Mandarin tradition was to know Confucius inside out and backwards. So he built on that tradition. He said, we're going to take an exam, but we don't want knowledge of Confucius anymore. What we want is knowledge of mathematics, science, and economics. And he said, I want young people, age range 25 to 35, and you've got to be a member of the Communist Party. 10% of the population. This cut it down from 1 billion people in China to 20 million. So 20 million were eligible to take this exam. Very prestigious to go in for it. So they go in, they have this exam, and then he picks the top 40 out of 20 million.
Wow.
That is pretty choosy, right? He gathers them together. Think of yourselves as 2 of the 40, right? And he says, you're the top 40 out of 20 million. Well done. Feeling good about yourselves? Feel a bit proud, Okay. So, brilliant. For the next 5 years, you are each going to be the governor of one of the 40 provinces of China. Your word will be law in that region. You will have full plenipotentiary powers directly from me. Right? Anything you say, your word is law in that region for the next 5 years. Feel better? Pretty good. Sounds pretty good now. We're really, really, really clever, and we've got to be king of a region.
That made me nervous, honestly. Yeah.
How old are you?
I'm 26.
Yeah, well, you're in. So you've got this region. You've never been there. Okay, then it starts to get a bit scary, because he says, the Politburo has decided what we want you to achieve in the next 5 years. There's always 2 things. There's an economic thing. You've got to double the income, per capita income of your country, of your region in the next 5 years. Easy? No. And you've got to halve infant mortality.
Crazy.
And then he says, we in the Politburo have no idea how to do it. None. Right? But we'll be watching you. This sounds a little bit scary, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then he says, if you've not started an initiative to raise the income and an initiative to reduce infant mortality, if you haven't started an initiative in the first 6 months, you are permanently thrown out of the top 40. You will never, ever in your life get back in.
Oh, wow.
Right? I, Deng Xiaoping, will make damn sure you never get back in if you haven't started something in the first 6 months. Now, this is tough, isn't it, eh? You're going to a region you've never been to before, and you've got to double its per capita income, and you've got to harvest infant mortality. Have you learned enough at SOAS to know how to double per capita income in 5 years?
Gosh, no.
Have you learned anything about infant mortality?
No.
So you mean you don't know how to do this? What are you going to do?
God knows.
You can't use God.
I'm trying to-
You're on your own. You're on your own. Right? You might quietly have a prayer, but you're on your own. And so, what you're going to do? What you're going to do?
Guess you just have to do it.
What do you have to do? You don't know how to reduce infant mortality. What's the best thing for you to do in this region? You've got full powers. Right?
Perhaps you'd research. God knows how to maneuver that.
Maybe you would need to go and ask some people in the region who might know something about infant mortality. Yeah? Who might know something about why a lot of infants are dying.
Doctors.
Yes, doctors or hospitals. You might want to go to hospitals and say, you might find there's a children's hospital in the region. You might go and say to the children's hospital, why are so many infants dying here?
Yeah.
Yeah? And they'll tell you something. You don't know whether it's right or wrong. What you do know is that you've got 5.5 months left to try something. Yeah? And so you're going to tell them, come up with something that we could try. Yeah? Come up with something that we could try. I'll give you the money to do it. I'll give you any legal powers you want. I'll enforce them. I'll make sure that whatever you want to do happens. Right? And what's more, you say, if you don't try something, if you don't get it started within the next 5.5 months, I'm going to sack you. Yeah. With my powers, yeah? Okay. How about the income side? If you want to know how to raise incomes, who might you talk to?
Maybe people who run who are selling things, what's going on.
You might want to talk to firms, businesses, if there are any, something like that. What are holding people back? So you're going to ask, and you're going to start something. Right? So Deng Xiaoping also says, I'll be watching you, right? And he is. So he's watching, and then he says, actually, your initiative on infant mortality doesn't seem to be working very well, does it? Just over there, in this very different region, whatever they're doing seems to be working for them. No, I don't know. I, Deng Xiaoping, don't know whether it's because they're over there and it's, maybe it's different climate, different something or other, whatever. Or it might be that they've hit a good idea. I don't know. I'm just telling you, you go and have a look. Go and have a look. If you think you can learn from it, do so. If you think it doesn't help in your region, it's not applicable, that's your judgment call, right? Just go and have a look. He's doing that all the time with both these initiatives across his 40 regions. By the end of the 5 years, some sort of patterns seem to be emerging. Deng thinks, basically the places on the coast, it seems to be pretty easy to raise incomes fast as long as they produce stuff for export and ship it out. In the inland regions, it's a different story. It's harder. So we've got to do something else. Maybe it's agriculture that we've got to develop or something like that. So he learns these sort of patterns. Same with infant mortality. 5 years up, right. You get promoted according to, just how well he thinks you've done, right? You don't get thrown out of the top 40, but whether you then become mayor of Shanghai or some more minor thing, you're not shot for the lack of success. you're shocked if you haven't tried any initiatives, right? So what happens then? Another 5 years, start it all over again. And that system survives beyond Deng's death. It runs for 8 5-year periods, so 40 years. Right? That 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, is the most spectacular decline in global poverty that the world has ever seen in 4,000 years of human history. Right? So what Deng had set up, possibly without realizing it, but it was a process of very rapid learning by experiments in parallel. Learn from others abroad, but then especially run experiments in parallel. And that was a fabulously successful process. So that's devolution at its best. You devolve to economic units. Typically, it seems to be something of about 5 million or so, 5-10 million, that sort of thing, range. That's a sensible compromise between shortening the distance. You want as short a distance as possible between the doer and the affected. As long as you get big enough that there are scale economies. And so Deng Xiaoping had sort of inadvertently sort of hit on that sort of thing. Economic units that were small enough so that you could sort of see the consequences between the doer and the affected, but also big enough that you got enough scale that you could get things done. Scale, build clusters of firms and that sort of thing.
There's this aspect of localized learning to the region, it seems. Right? These people are going into regions they've never been there before, and in this example, the first thing they do is go talk to the people first.
Yeah, because it was democracy in action, in effect. I mean, of course, he wasn't a Democrat, but it created a situation where the people in power had to ask and listen. Because if they didn't, they were doomed to fail.
Do you think, because I was actually talking to one of my mates who's Chinese himself, and he talks about Xi Jinping and how he sort of turned his back on what Deng had practiced, and he's centralizing China again, and complete dismissal almost of what actually gave China its success.
Yes, I think that's right.
And he kind of detests a lot of Xi Jinping's policies. So, and I also wanted to mention, so me and my aunt were actually talking about politics in Nigeria, and devolution does seem, I can see the fruit of devolution. However, in Nigeria, different states, they sort of have, well, it's so heterogeneous, and even in different states, you have different ethnic groups. And I think what happens when you put a lot of agency on the local states, there's like these tribal wars within the local states. So they don't actually do anything out of pragmatism or for the benefit of the state. It's mostly about, I need to ensure my people are okay. And so there becomes this sort of tribalism within these states, and devolution perhaps might not take off in a scenario where this, within the context of a place like Nigeria. So how do you overcome a situation like that?
Yeah. I mean, everything you say, I think, is right. It's difficult. You need, I think, social movements that cut across tribe. I'll give you a couple of examples from within Africa. So in where should we start? We'll say in Botswana, you had a very good leader, Seretse Khama. Botswana was, when he first came to power, very, very poor. It was pretty much the poorest country in Africa. It was dirt poor. But the big mining company, De Beers, came and said, you might have diamonds because the neighboring countries have got diamonds, and we'd like to look to find them. And so Seretse Khama went round all the clans. Botswana doesn't have tribes, but it has clans, which is not so dissimilar. And he said to all the clan leaders, we might have got diamonds. We don't know if we get them. We don't know where they are. And I'm going to ask you what system you'd like us to have. We can have either a system which says whichever clan finds them can keep them, or we can have a system that says wherever they're found in Botswana, they belong to all Botswanans. I'll do whichever you want. You tell me which you want. And the clan leaders, this took a year where they thought about it. And eventually each clan leader worked out what Seretse Khama had already understood before the beginning, which was that it was vital that the diamonds should belong to everybody in Botswana. The people needed to come together. And the nightmare of each clan leader that persuaded them was the thought, supposing the neighboring tribe discovers them and my tribe doesn't, my clan will certainly say the neighboring clan is being selfish, they should share them. And the leader of the neighboring clan will say, but the leader of your clan agreed that if we found them and you didn't, we should keep them. You go and ask him. And the thought of that, every clan leader came to Seretse Khama and said, no, wherever they are, they belong to everybody. Now that was good leadership. And Khama kept on being a good leader because he also thought we need to guard against what should we do with this money? The danger is that people will say, gosh, we suddenly are rich. We don't need to work anymore. And so he introduced a preemptive neutralizing proposition, if you remember neutralizing propositions, because what Khama wanted to do was save and invest the money, use the money to develop the economy, infrastructure, and if they couldn't find decent infrastructure to build, rather than waste it, they'd put it in a little sovereign wealth fund. And so he had a preemptive narrative which said, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. And every poor person in Botswana could understand that. They themselves were poor and they were carrying a heavy load. And what did that mean? We're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. It means step by step we have to get out of poverty. It'll be a slow process of climbing out. And sure enough, a maverick politician came and said, "We've got diamonds, we should spend it. We're rich, we don't have to work anymore." If you write it down, we're rich, we don't have to work anymore, and we're poor, we have to carry a heavy load. We're poor, we have to carry a heavy load is concept for concept a refutation of we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. We're rich, no, we're poor. Huh? We don't have to work anymore, we have to carry a heavy load. And so people just laughed at this maverick politician, said, "Don't be an idiot, don't be an idiot." And so that was Karma using a preemptive neutralizing proposition against populism. And finally, the thing that was really great about Karma was that De Beers had told him, because he was himself a clan leader, they said, wherever the diamonds are, we know that they're under your clans. You know, your clan's got them. Yeah. And this was great statesmanship, because instead of saying, my clan's going to be rich as long as we have finders keepers, Karma put country before his own group. And that takes us finally to the point that you were making. How do you get beyond this sort of tribalism? A good leader can do it. Yeah? I think we're seeing that at the moment in Zambia with President Hichilema. And Hichilema is from a very minor tribe and won an election with a tidal wave of youth votes. Hichilema was a technocrat, is a technocrat. He's an economist, and he's already a self-made man, so he's rich. So he doesn't need power to make money. He was trying to change his country, improve his country. And so he fought an election against a crooked president who was the incumbent, who was standing. And the crooked president thought he could win with a combination of lies, exaggerations, and I'll count the votes. And Hichilema managed to appeal to youth. And so a tidal wave of youth vote said, we've had 50 years of democracy in Zambia, but it's got us nowhere. Party A and Party B, they're both patronage parties, playing this dirty game of when Party A is in, all the A's get the money. When Party B is in, it's the B's get the money. That's no good. And so Hichilema broke through that with a youth vote. You're starting to see signs of that in Nigeria, a youth vote. I was particularly keen on Peter Obi. So I was a supporter of Peter Obi, but actually even President Tinubu, when he was governor in Lagos State, did a pretty good job of restoring Lagos. So there's hope, I think, in Nigeria that you can, by appealing to youth, you can actually move beyond the tribalism. Youth can become the integrating concept. Africa is this paradox. It's by far the youngest population. And so it's got massive youth vote. It's also got by far the oldest presidents. Right? Though it looked as if America under Trump and Biden would equal it, but some African presidents are even older than either Trump or Biden.
I think Tinubu's.
Yeah,
as well.
So here's a case where a youth vote could actually move beyond tribalism, and you're seeing these stirrings of youth protest in Nigeria.
And I think I hope this youth does kind of overcomes tribalism, because tribalism is very entrenched into the fabric of the society, and we kind of feel like it would perhaps plague us for years to come. And I think it's about just creating national identity and social unity, and that we're all one, and we all have this communal purpose, because it's so important for a nation to have this. Otherwise, I think these differences will get in the way.
I mean, it sounds romantic, but the person in Africa who most strongly believed that was President Nyerere, the founding president of Tanzania and one of the great African leaders. And I was very proud. Of my first book actually won a prize it won the SOAS Prize. It was called Labor and Poverty in Rural Tanzania. And so yes, I remember coming to SOAS and getting this prize. There was even a bit of money attached to it. And I'd written that book together with a couple of Tanzanians. And I got a letter from President Nyerere thanking me for helping build the country. And it was a treasured thing. But what did Nyerere do? Nyerere was a modest man, a very decent man. He wasn't power obsessed, but he didn't want. He said we cannot afford to go straight to democracy. Now, what did he mean by that? He said democracy needs political parties. Democracy without political parties is nothing. What is it? And the political parties need organization. And at the moment in Tanzania, this was 1961, if we create political parties in Tanzania, the only basis for organization of parties will be tribal. We've got 50 tribes, we'll have 50 parties, including 2 or 3 really big ones. So that's no good. We need first to learn to become Tanzanians. And only once we've all realized we're Tanzanians can we dare to go to democracy. And so he saw it as a phased process. And so he started with just the one party, the National Party. And Nyerere got his economics all wrong, but his politics all right. And the economics can always be corrected. But the politics, building that shared identity, happened in Tanzania. It was achieved, and it's a hugely valuable legacy. Across this arbitrary boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, if we go from Kenya to Tanzania, Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, got his economics better than Nyerere. And so in the first few years, Kenya became more prosperous than Tanzania, but he got his politics all wrong. And so Kenyatta did everything to help his own tribe, the Kikuyu. And when he died suddenly, he was replaced, according to the Constitution, by his vice president. And the vice president was from a relatively minor tribe, the Kalenjin. and suddenly everything switched from being for the Kikuyu to being for the Kalenjin. And then we had battles backwards and forwards in tribal politics ever since. We're still with it. We're still with this tribal politics. And so, having never had that phase of building shared identity, Kenya is still struggling to get beyond tribe, whereas Tanzania has got beyond it. And so I think in the end, Nyerere was proved to be the greater man.
It's so interesting you're saying this, because I was actually having a discussion the other day with my Rwandan friend, and we were both talking about politics in Africa and the concept and the debate about authoritarianism versus democracy. And we were sort of agreeing with what you were saying. I mean, in a lot of these countries, democracy will just exacerbate tribalism. And especially for him, he's of Rwandan origin. He was saying, listen, he knows more than anyone kind of the benefit of having just this leader which everybody listens to. I mean, I know Kagame's regime is quite contentious. I mean, his democracy is a liberal, let's say, and there's other downsides of his regime, but he was just harping on about the benefits of having just one leader which everybody listens to. And the situation in Rwanda, I think, is somewhat of a miracle, because that place was hell on earth about 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a surprisingly sort of neat test case, which is the comparison of Rwanda and Burundi, because they were part of the same country during the colonial period. So the colonial, they're the same. Ethnically, they're the same combination of two tribes, Burundi got the full United Nations model of a leap straight to democracy. Instant move from dictatorship to full democracy. And Rwanda has had this much more, I think of as a gradual 50-year process of first build pride in the country. We're all Rwandan. And then, let's see, then I think it'll be Rwanda which ends up the stable democracy and not Burundi. But what's happened since the starting line, which was 1994, by 1998, the two countries had identical per capita income, identical. Burundi, since 1998, its per capita income has fallen by 10%. It's now the poorest country in the world. It's lurched back into dictatorship, and it's very violent. It's had a huge refugee problem, and a lot of the refugees have fled Burundi to come to Rwanda. Meanwhile, Rwanda has, give or take, tripled per capita income. So the Burundi down 10%, poorest country in world, Rwanda triple per capita income is, as you say, its rate of poverty reduction is comparable to China during that 40-year period of miracle. And that's amazing, because Rwanda is no natural advantages. It's poor, very landlocked.
Not many resources.
Rather overpopulated, no natural resources. So it's in one sense, it's a bit analogous to one of my other comparisons, Denmark, which is bleak, and Denmark's not landlocked, but it's in a lousy location and it's no natural resources. It's still pretty much the most successful country on earth. So Rwanda's a case of good but strong leadership in the context, which I think will transition to democracy. I think whether Paul Kagame wants democracy or not, I have no idea. But I suspect that in another 50 years, Rwanda will be a democracy because it'll have reached a level of per capita income where everybody's happy to, and they've also will have learned how to have a shared identity, pride in being Rwandan, and an ability to come together around common purposes. So these are the things that they're useful role models for Africa to look at. Nigeria is huge potential. You've got so much money in Nigeria, and such an innovative and vigorous population. Nigerians succeed everywhere on earth. Nigerians succeed, except in Nigeria. And that tells you something, that Nigerians are enormously resourceful, phenomenally creative, right? Full of energy and imagination, creativity, but you're not so good at coming together. And so the skill that's missing that leaves Nigeria poor instead of as rich as Denmark. Have you got the innovative capacity of Denmark? My God, yes, right? Have you got the habits of coming together? Well, Denmark 100 years ago didn't have those habits. Denmark built them. 100 years ago, Denmark was a shit place. Right? That's a technical economics use of the term. In the mid-19th century, the aristocracy was hanging the peasantry from trees. It was a vicious and viciously divided society. Somehow Denmark struggled out of that past. Of course, if you ask Danes now, they've forgotten their past. It's too long ago. And so Denmark will just preach about how to be Denmark now. They don't know how Denmark became Denmark. It didn't become Denmark by, sort of leap into let's all love each other, but it did become Denmark step by step. And that's the process that Nigeria will learn, step by step. And for that, a bit of decentralization, I think, is a good idea.
Regarding this Botswana and Diamond story, it's interesting to me because you mentioned this concept, the pre-source curse, where a country would find resources and it would lead to conflict. Can you talk about that? So that didn't happen in Botswana, but where has it happened elsewhere, and why does that happen?
Yeah, it's happened in a lot of places. So the pre-source curse, that's just a neat name for a phenomenon that as soon as places discover a natural resource, you get what Seretse Khama managed to preempt and avoid in Botswana. Tanzania did discover in the end gas offshore. And this was 2012, and I was brought in to advise the then government. And I said, be careful. I told them the story of Seretse Khama and Botswana, and make sure that you build agreement as to who this gas is going to belong to. And they shook their heads and said, Paul, you've forgotten. You're in Tanzania. Nyereri's done all that for us. Everybody knows that And what's more, it's offshore. It's not even discovered in the country. It's off the bloody shore. Of course it will belong to everybody. Everybody will know that. Well, it turned out everybody didn't know that. So the gas was offshore in the south of the country, offshore of a very poor region called Mtwara. And within months, there was a movement in Mtwara which had a chant, "It's Mtwara's gas." Right?
Were you there to witness all the protests?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely, because it got violent.
Really?
Not mega violent.
I think you mentioned 4 people.
Yeah,
were killed.
4 people were killed in riots, which in a peaceful society like Tanzania, this was dramatic news. And the 6 months later, the head of the civil service said to me that the biggest mistake we made was not listening to that bit of advice about just make it clear to everybody that, of course, the gas belongs to all of us. And I was very conscious of that because of what happened in Scotland. We've got a very powerful Scottish Nationalist Party, which moved from no MPs to, at its peak, nearly every MP in Scotland was Scottish nationalist, with the slogan, "It's Scotland's oil." Right? Even though it was off somewhere in the North Sea, it was Scotland's North Sea. So these pre-resource curse effects of saying it's out. There's 2 sides to it. One is the identity problem, which I just explained, a sense of it's ours, and the other, the problem of gleeful, we don't have to work anymore. And so one is a struggle over who should own it, and the other is a struggle about what should we do with it. Should we use it to build a better future for everybody, or should we throw a party? And of course, the political mavericks will want to throw a party. In fact, that's what the Scottish Nationalist Party did. It did both it's Scotland's oil and let's throw a party.
But I think you also mentioned that the IMF are also susceptible to this.
Very good. Yeah, you read it closely. Completely right. So this is not my research. It's one of my associates who did this, and what he found was that the IMF itself bought into this euphoria, and so the IMF estimates of growth in the country once the oil had been discovered, or the gas or whatever, were considerable exaggerations of what actually happened. Many resource discoveries turn out to be the company that discovers them exaggerates them for all sorts of bad commercial reasons, right? The company quietly sells its shares during the euphoria, and then it turns out, they exaggerated too late. But also just the sheer sense of we've found this resource, it will lead to higher growth. Completely exaggerated. It takes many years to establish whether something is a commercial find or not. Even when you've struck oil, which is about the most straightforward of things, the chances of that strike being commercial, having your first drill, we've struck oil, chances of it being commercial are 1 in 9. Right? So oil companies have got to strike 9 times before they find commercially viable oil. So just because you've got news, we've found some oil, most of those won't lead to anywhere, won't lead to growth. In fact, they'll lead to, the danger is they lead to euphoria and arguments about whose it is without any benefits. And the IMF became inadvertently contaminated by exactly these things. They exaggerated the growth rate that they thought would happen. And that led to the credit rating agencies saying, oh, yes, you can borrow. The IMF says it's going to be very fast growth. You can borrow. And that got countries to borrow. What did they do with the money they borrowed? Throw a party. And that's landed them into debt crises. And a lot of poor countries now are in debt crises. The 26 most heavily indebted countries in the world are now in crisis. So these are very avoidable tragedies from misuse of natural resources.
But I think this sentiment it's ubiquitous, because when I have conversations with fellow development students, they kind of can't get past the fact that they almost just they conflate resources with wealth and success. But you highlight how complicated it is. It's not about resource management. And I think if you also compare how Norway dealt with the North Sea and the UK, and I think Norway was a lot more under state control and the UK were going through privatization, you can see...
Absolutely. So so Norway was much more successful, but even Norway struggled because they initially called it, they built this sovereign wealth fund, like Botswana. Botswana has built a very successful sovereign wealth fund. Norway has the biggest sovereign wealth fund on earth, but they made the terrible mistake of calling it the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And that word wealth conjures up images in ordinary people's mind. We're rich. That's very bad misinformation, because even Norway's sovereign wealth fund has to be divided by the population. And yes, it's lots of billions, but once you've divided by 7 million people, it's a good sum per person. But is it so much that it means you never have to work anymore? No. And sure enough, when they got this national wealth fund and it built up, a populist party started in Norway, which said, let's spend it. And it rocketed up in the polls, and the public opinion polls. It became the largest, the most popular party in Norway. At which point, the governing party at the time, the one that was in government, sent him for some communications experts, not me, and said, what should we do? And the communications experts spotted this problem and said, people don't understand what is sovereign wealth. You've said this sovereign wealth fund is so many billion. People don't understand it. They just think we're rich. If we've got all these billions, we should indeed spend it. So the government said, well, what should we do? They said, well, you've got to change the name. You need to call it something that is close enough to what ordinary people can understand. And the thing in Norway, they discovered, the best thing was to say, call it the National Pension Fund. Because lots of people in Norway have a pension, save for a pension, and they know that if you save for a pension, you don't take your money out when you're 45 and spend it. You build it up until you're 65 or 70 or whatever, and then you retire and you live on the gradually drawing it down. And the Ministry of Finance in Norway said, oh, we can't call it the National Pension Fund. It's not really used for pensions. But the consultant said, well, it's very straightforward. You either call it the National Pension Fund, but if you call it the National Wealth Fund, you won't have any wealth in the fund, and so you won't need to worry what to call it. It won't be there.
Yeah.
So on that recommendation, they changed the name, and then very rapidly people understood this is not something that we spend. It would be stupid to spend it, the National Pension Fund, and so the Populist Party disappeared. So communication matters. Getting language right, words matter.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's and words matter not just for natural resources, but for building national unity. All these processes that we started with, we can draw to a close and finish with, that trying to build national purpose, common purpose, depends on using language more successfully than the charlatans, the mavericks, the Donald Trumps of this world. And so we have to be just as smart as the clever mavericks. We've got one advantage. What we say can be honest. And in the end, an honest message, I think, will win out over a dishonest message. Honest hopefulness can trump dishonest hopefulness. But as Trump shows, dishonest hopefulness will trump honest misery.
I like the fact that you say that language matters. And I wonder, I mean, especially in economics, we can maybe throw around language, but I wonder, will you think of certain terms like development or even developing countries? We throw this term around like, we'll have developed countries and developing countries. But as, for example, left behind countries, someone will call them developing countries, saying, well, they're developing. No, actually, they're not developing and they're getting worse. So how important is it to get the words right, and how meaningful is it to use correct language?
I think it's very important. I think this distinction between developing and developed is a rubbish set of descriptions. There are some countries that are falling down, even once high income ones. I mean, Argentina has been declining relatively for 120 years. By virtue of its past, it's still in the G20. But really, it's a declining country. Ethiopia is a fast-growing country. It's a rising country. And so, in a way, a better language is rising countries and falling countries. Africa has several rising countries. India is very clearly a rising country. And so that concept, I think, is a more helpful distinction. These are countries that are clearly on a path to building a more prosperous, a more inclusive future. And then the countries that are on the way down. I'd like to believe in a country that I live in a country which is still on the way up, but let's see. Let's see. It needs to be. So that's I think a good place to wrap up. Let's try and learn more from the rising countries, learn how they're successful, and learn from them and have the modesty that a declining country like Argentina needs to learn from a rising country like Ethiopia, and not be so arrogant as to say we've nothing to learn.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming today. It was an absolute privilege to.
Thanks for
have this
inviting me.
conversation.
And let me end as I began. You and your audience, you're building the future. Don't make the mess of it that our generation made.
We'll try not to.
Be the next 1945ers. Right?
There we go.
We'll try our best.